Hi everyone. It's a real privilege to present my research on the impact of time allowances in the EAP Reading to Write assessment context. I presented some preliminary findings at the CRELLA Spring Seminar in 2018, but since then I've completed my PhD, so I can share more extensive findings with you today. I'd like to start by setting the context for why we've arrived at where we are now in terms of the prevalence of integrated task types in EAP assessment. It's over 25 years since Leckie and Carson conducted a survey of EAP students to compare the writing assignments in their content courses with those in their EAP programs. They concluded that for the most part, EAP programs don't expose students to the types of writing tasks which are set in their major courses. Based on their findings, they encourage teachers to look beyond the EAP classroom to the authentic writing demands of the wider university context and to consider how to prepare students for those demands. This is essentially the same argument made by Hamp, Lyons and Kroll, that assessments in academic contexts must reflect students' ability to use writing not only for knowledge telling, but also for the more cognitively demanding skill of knowledge construction. However, until relatively recently, the traditional timed independent writing task has been a common method of assessing writing in standardized tests for university entrance purposes, as well as on university English courses. Cumming points out that university students are mainly asked to write as a means of displaying their understanding of lecture content and ideas from their reading, and also their ability to analyse, evaluate and critique these ideas. This understanding of the construct definition of academic literacy, combined with the desire for more authentic assessment, have resulted in EAP testing and assessment colleagues increasingly adopting integrated tasks for their in-house assessments and exams. My research focused on a reading to write assessment tasks which required students to read 4 short source texts and integrate ideas into their essay to develop their position on the topic. Tasks such as these are seen to better reflect the intimate relationship between reading and writing that characterises university study, and also elicit high-level reading skills such as discourse synthesis. These tasks have been replacing or maybe complementing independent reading and writing tasks in EAP assessment for a number of years. However, the success of these tasks largely depends on the context in which they're administered, for a number of reasons, including financial constraints, practicality, and in some cases, reliability concerns. Many reading to write assessments are conducted under exam conditions, with students reading assigned texts and composing under a time restriction. As a result, many of the limitations which we associate with the traditional timed independent essay, such as a lack of time for planning, reflection, and writing on an unknown topic, still apply, and the task fails to resemble a real university assignment. So how is this related to my research context? Well, the idea for this research arose from my own personal involvement with reading to write tasks in the capacity of Programme Leader for Assessment in the English Language Centre at City University of Hong Kong. Our year-long compulsory English for General Academic Purposes programme included reading to write assessment tasks done in timed or exam conditions, and also those done in extended or out-of-class conditions. My interactions with students in consultations and classes, and also with colleagues in standardisation sessions, prompted me to consider whether students were behaving in the same way in the different writing contexts. I began to question whether the underlying constructs are the same, and whether writing in timed conditions allows students, especially novice undergraduate writers, to use the real-life behaviours which these reading to write assessments are designed to promote. This was especially pertinent since we were using the same multiple trait scoring rubric to measure performance in both timed and untimed conditions. This context provided the rich environment for my research plan to take shape. My research design involved the same group of students composing 2 source-based essays, one in class under exam conditions with a 1 hour 45-minute time allowance, and the other outside class with a 1-week deadline. A fully counterbalanced design was adopted to control for task and order effects. Group 1, made up of 2 EAP classes, completed the out-of-class writing task first, with Group 1A writing on the minimum wage topic and 1B writing on the role models topic. The topics were then reversed for the timed in-class writing. As you can see, this format was reversed for Group 2 students, with topics controlled in the same way. The 2 essay tasks were administered within 10 days of each other to limit the effect of teaching and learning. I'll share my research questions and data collection instruments. Research questions 1 and 2 were designed to investigate the similarities and differences in essay length, scores, and reference types and uses between students writing in the timed and the extended condition. These relied on quantitative or performance data. The instruments used to answer these questions were the EAP Writing Assessment Rubric, which is a multiple trait scoring instrument assessing task fulfillment, discourse competencies, language competencies, and source integration. All essays were anonymized and scored by 3 raters who were familiar with the rubric as they were using it in their teaching and they attended frequent standardization sessions. Raters were unaware of which condition the essays had been produced in. I employed a coding scheme for reference types to investigate the frequency of the reference types in each condition. This was adapted from Teresa Hyland's classification system. And I used an empirically developed coding scheme for reference uses to investigate the frequency of reference uses. Research questions 3 and 4 investigated students' personal insights into their composing behaviour. So this was basically self-report data. And I used 3 instruments. The first was a writing log which students completed to document their out-of-class writing behaviour. This was the only instrument which was used for data collection in one of the conditions rather than both. The next was a post-writing questionnaire which students completed after both essays on SurveyMonkey. And finally, I used the discourse-based interview method with the same 12 students after they had completed both of the essays. It was only through a combination of the 2 types of data that I could gain a complete understanding of the differences between the 2 conditions. The quantitative data revealed, for example, which reference types were most popular in each condition, but gave no insight as to why. The self-report data was needed to make sense of the quantitative data. Before sharing some key findings for each of the 4 research questions, I'd like to explain how long students spent writing in the out-of-class condition and how they actually used the 1-week period, as this contextualizes my findings. This information was gleaned from the writing logs. Basically, when given the freedom and flexibility to work in the out-of-class condition, students tended to invest longer on the task than the 1 hour 45-minute time allocation provided for the in-class condition. In fact, 87.5% of participants spent more than 1 hour 45 minutes composing their out-of-class essay. Students tended not to complete their out-of-class essay in a single session, preferring to break it down into stages and work in multiple sessions. 25% completed in a single session, but 37.5% wrote it in 2 sessions, and this was the most popular approach. 3/4 of the students who wrote the essay over more than 1 session reported spending the first session engaged purely in pre-writing processes. You can see the behaviours they reported on the slide, and these are in vivo terms taken from the writing logs. For example, reading the question, thinking about the question, reading the sources, highlighting the sources, and so on. Let's turn to research question 3 on student preferences, as I think it's helpful to look at this one before the other research questions. The post-writing questionnaire included a question asking which condition students preferred. 66% preferred the out-of-class condition, while only 14% the in-class, and 20% had no preference. Students were asked to give reasons, and I conducted a thematic analysis. Approximately 85% of the students who expressed a preference for the out-of-class condition made reference to either the stress-free atmosphere of writing outside the class or the pressure and anxiety caused by writing in a timed condition. Conversely, those who preferred the timed condition thought that working under time pressure induced a heightened cognitive state and increased motivation. So time pressure could be perceived to be facilitating or debilitating depending on the individual. And I'll share a few student sound bites with you. So the first one, this student didn't have a preference. Doing writing assessment at home is more relaxable, but maybe muzzy, while in exam conditions, time is limited, so it's more efficient, but a little nervous. The second one preferred the extended condition. Two things are totally different. When you're writing with a time limit, you feel your thoughts are squeezed out of your mind. Yet when you write without a time limit, the thoughts flow out of your mind. Also, the time limitation makes some thoughts disorganized. And this one preferred the time condition. In exam, I can finish my work fast, efficiently. The time limitation helped me to think about many ideas at very short time. I will get some new ideas under the pressure, which may need long time to think, or I will never think if I'm at home. Let's look now at research question 1A on essay length. Regardless of the different time allowances, the task guidelines required a 600-word essay in both conditions. So if you look at the table, you can see that a mean word count of 590 was calculated for the out-of-class essays, and this is 11% higher than the in-class mean of 532. The difference in the essay lengths was statistically significant. Next, I ranked participants according to their overall performance, which was the total of the scores for both essays from 3 raters. So this was out of a possible score of 120. And then I divided them into 3 groups to look at the impact on students of different levels of ability. Group 1 were the highest performers and Group 3 were the lowest performers. The mean word counts show that the higher performing students tended to write more than the lower performers in both writing conditions, and that essays were longer in the out-of-class condition for all 3 groups. The biggest positive difference was observed in the Group 1 students. Looking now at research question 1B, the mean score for the essays written in the out-of-class condition was 7.2% higher than the mean score for those written in the in-class condition. I ran a paired samples t-test, and this confirmed that participants' better performance in the out-of-class condition was significant. I then did a tripartite comparison to investigate the differences between high, mid, and low performing students in the 2 conditions, just as I'd done with the word count data. The results suggest a positive relationship between students' overall performance and their higher score in the extended condition. Although an increase in the mean score was observed for all 3 groups, the better the students performed overall, the greater the score difference in the out-of-class essays tended to be. It's also apparent that a higher percentage of Group 1 students displayed a positive difference in the extended condition. This was 76% compared to 57% and 47% for the Group 2 and 3 students respectively. Moving on to question 1C, I'm going to look at reference types but not reference uses, as I don't feel we've got time for all of that today. The coding scheme for reference types is the tool I used for classifying the different citation types. 4 specific types of references were classified along a continuum from direct to indirect, with quasi-direct and quasi-indirect in the middle. The 4 types of source use were further classified according to documenting, which means including the source information, and also bounding, which means separation from the main text, either in a mechanical way, such as with quotation marks, or rhetorically through language, such as a reporting structure. This resulted in 4 variations of each of the 4 citation types. For example, bounded and documented, or bounded and undocumented. Let me give you an example. A direct quote, which is inside quotation marks, like the one on the slide, but is not reference is considered to be bounded but undocumented. So the code for this is D for direct quote, B for bounded, and U for undocumented. And this resulted in 16 different classifications on the coding scheme. So let's look at the data. The total number of references in all essays in both conditions was very similar. There were 244 in the in-class essays and 246 in the out-of-class essays. Direct references accounted for around 1/3 of the total number of references in both conditions. However, you can see much bigger differences in the indirect and quasi-indirect references. There was a tendency for students in the out-of-class condition to include more indirect references, or full paraphrases, than any other reference type. These accounted for more than 42% of all references. A Wilcoxon signed ranks test confirmed a statistically significant difference was observed between the indirect and quasi-indirect reference types. And a Kruskal-Wallis test confirmed a significant interaction between performance and the use of the indirect reference type in both conditions, but no statistically significant interactions for the other 3 reference types. Let's look specifically at the indirect reference type. This graph shows the 16 different reference types. At the left, you can see students' strong preference for the direct, bounded, documented reference type, regardless of the time allowance. At the right, you can see all of the indirect reference types or full paraphrases, with a strong trend towards the indirect, unbounded, undocumented type, which is deemed to be a transgression since it's an undocumented appropriation of a source idea. This accounted for 24% of all of the references in the out-of-class essays. The cross-tabulation shows that the difference is more apparent with the Group 1 students, the highest scoring ones. In the out-of-class condition, almost 74% of Group 1 students included at least one IUU reference. This is an interesting finding, since although it would be expected that when given more time, students would include more full paraphrases, one would assume that they'd make an effort to ensure that their citation technique complied with the academic integrity guidelines, especially the higher performing students. So the fact that there were more instances of undocumented references seemed counterintuitive. What I'd like to do here is to show how synthesis of the self-report data with the quantitative findings was invaluable to reaching interpretations and answering the research questions. And I'll use the unexpected example of the IUU reference type. As I've mentioned already, students reported that they spent longer on their out-of-class essays. They generally worked over more than one session, engaged in multiple readings of the sources, and had time to check and revise. So I had assumed that they would make fewer transgressions, particularly the higher performers. However, analysis of writers' explanations of their source text use showed that unacknowledged paraphrases were not necessarily a result of transgressive behaviour, but rather a consequence of different composing behaviour which stemmed from the increased interaction with the sources. I'll share some examples of sound bites from the discourse-based interviews after the extended condition. So this one shows that the student maximised the abundant time to engage with the sources, to reread them and combine the ideas. The second one shows how sources were used as a springboard to inspire the student and to generate new ideas. And the last one was the highest scoring student, explaining why he felt he didn't need to provide a reference for an idea which he had, which also appeared in the sources, as it was already hiding in his mind and inspired by the sources. It seems the increased time resulted in more engagement with the sources and was conducive to the high-level skills of knowledge construction and discourse synthesis, especially for the higher performers. As source ideas were processed, they naturally became embedded in a reader's existing idea bank, and this resulted in a meshing together and an inadvertent blurring of the boundaries between source and own ideas. This is consistent with the literature on discourse synthesis and reading to write processes, which identified more interaction with sources, a more constructive approach to composing, and more connection with own ideas among the more proficient students. However, it also highlights the grey areas which exist and the insufficiency of academic writing instruction to prepare students for such encounters. Pennycook refers to the complex relationship between text, memory, and learning. Writers who have good textual memories can unknowingly claim ownership of ideas they've read. My data suggest an unconscious and natural knowledge construction approach to composing, which was more prevalent when writers had more time, especially higher performers. It shows that many students had already surpassed the basic level of instruction provided by the EAP course, which generally teaches them that a paraphrase involves faithfully rewriting a source idea in their own words and then adding their own elaboration in the following sentence. They were behaving in an intuitive way, engaging in knowledge transformation to complete the task, and this involved reliance on a type of reference that was coded by my scheme as unacknowledged borrowing. As Chandra Sommer, Thompson and Pennycook suggested, transgressive intertextuality is developmental and multifactorial, and this leads me to believe that this behaviour is a positive step in students' journey to becoming a competent academic writer who's able to recontextualise source content to construct their argument. Yet at the same time, it highlights the inadequacy of relying on quantitative coding schemes alone to understand source text use. So, to sum up, the mixed methods approach in this study has revealed clear differences in students' source use, composing behaviour, performance, and feelings. My findings suggest that essays produced in the timed and extended conditions are two different manifestations of the dynamic reading to write construct, and that if both types of writing are required in the wider university context, then EAP programs should support students with acquiring the critical flexibility to adapt their composing behaviour in order to employ effective strategies to achieve success in both conditions. This has particular relevance for those involved in EAP curriculum and assessment development. Kuder and Harwood investigated advanced level L2 writers' task representation in test-like and non-test-like conditions, and their implications align with those which have arisen from my study. They found that writers who'd been taught to write in exam conditions followed a mechanical, recipe-like approach to composing regardless of the condition. These students failed to adapt their writing strategies in the non-test-like condition to maximise the potential of the extra time. On the other hand, students who'd been taught to engage in extensive planning and apply knowledge transforming processes didn't have time in the test-like condition to display their true ability. Just as my research suggests, Kuder and Harwood warn that a single approach to teaching writing is a deficit model which doesn't equip students with the best strategies to write in different contexts. It's important to empower test takers to find their own voice and to see the need to alter their task representations as the situation permits. So I'd like to leave you with the words of Worden, which align well with the insights gained from my study and provide an apt synopsis. I'll give you a moment to read through this before I bring up the references. Thank you very much. Please do feel free to get in touch. I think my presentation will be uploaded to the CRELLA website.